Thank you for your interest in learning more about cow herd cost of production. This program was done as a part of our Boots in the Barn program in 2018.
One of the things that I like to always put up when we're talking about cost of production is this slide, and it's from Livestock Market Information Service. And they just track cost of production across years. And you can see, for the most part, back to 1990, we kind of were sticking in that this is a profit. But looking at returns or profit, and we've kind of stayed right in that, break even to $100 profit for the last 20 some years, except 2014, and that's where we had a real skyrocket in feeder calf prices. Remember, because of the drought we had in 2012, caused a lot of cows to be sold, and so we had a lot of shortage in calves, and so the prices in 2014 went up. But what I really want to point out is this is looking at return over cash costs. It's not looking at all of your costs. It's only looking at kind of your out-of-pocket costs, or what you would, I always equate that to what you write a check for. But note the estimate for 2018 is that we're looking at kind of negative to break even numbers in terms of profit or return. So this is one we look at. Now this is a calculated or estimated number. This isn't based on producers actually keeping costs. It's an estimate. But it's one place that we can start when we think about cost of production. What do you think your cost of production is? Do you think it's costing you $400 a cow, or $600 to keep that cow for a year, or $800 or $1,000? And then I'm going to ask you, what's included in that number? What did you use to actually calculate that cost? Obviously, we think about those things we write a check for, like feed and vets and pasture rent or ownership and hired labor. But we oftentimes don't think about those non-cash costs, or sometimes we call those fixed costs. And that'd be things like depreciation on the cows or machinery. What's our family labor? Because obviously we don't get paid a salary, or most of us don't. We get the profits at the end. And also, what's our opportunity costs, or what's it cost us to have money tied up in cows and pasture and machinery? It's not a cash cost, but would you make more money having your money invested in the stock market or in rental houses than in the cow business? So something to think, that's not near as much fun, but something else to think about. So when we think about, you'll hear me use the words standardized performance analysis. And basically that's really looking at how we calculate our numbers so that we're all comparing apples to apples instead of apples to oranges. This also comes from Livestock Market Information Service, and it's looking at what was our estimated cash costs per cow from 1989 on. And they've got this dotted line trying to look at, from 89 to 2018 as a straight line. I would argue that from 89 to roughly the early 2000s, we were pretty much flat, and our costs were running right around $400 a year per cow. And then we saw a bump coming about 2006 or so, and kind of hit another platform for about 5 years, and then another jump, and then a couple big jumps when we got into the drought years. We've seen those costs kind of level off at $800. But a lot of times when I talk to a producer about, average cost to keep a cow is $800, they'll argue with me. They don't think it can be that high. And I think that's very realistic. I think we have a lot of producers that are well up into that $1,000 per cow per year as they start to look at all their costs. But average at 800, I think, is pretty realistic. But again, I want to point out, this is based on cash costs. So it includes pasture rent in there, or a fee for pasture rent, but it doesn't include some of those non-cash costs like depreciation and opportunity cost and family labor. The other thing, and this is old data, so the numbers are kind of not real significant in there. But what happened about the mid-1990s, a lot of states started to do standardized performance analysis, or SPA records. Iowa did in the early 90s. Illinois jumped on board about the mid-90s. And what Illinois did in their study is they looked at beef producers who did SPA records for 5 years, at least 5 years. And what happened to their cost of production over that 5-year timeline when they were actually keeping records. And their cost dropped $175 a cow, which doesn't sound like a whole lot. But when you put that as a percentage, they dropped their costs by a third simply by keeping the record, following that information, making decisions off of it, and looking at what are the big parts of their cost of production. So I like to talk about 30% reduction in cost of production by paying attention to your records. And that's pretty significant. At Iowa State, we really try to look at what drives profit. And a lot of times we think, well, our weaning weight, the size of our herd, what we sold feeder calves for, our breeding rate, conception rates. And what we found as we looked at the herds was, here's the correlation to return to labor and management. So another way to think about that is what predicts profitability in a herd. And you can see herd size only predicts 4% of the profitability. Percent of calf crop wean, 10%. Calf weaning weight, 28%. Calf price, only 1% of the profitability can be explained by calf price. So really looking at these numbers and predicting profits are pretty lowly correlated. Our costs, and most of these are related to the income side of things, our income is not very good at predicting profits. So what is? And as we looked at some other numbers on the cost side, these are all pretty highly predictable, right? Where of course costs are going to be very closely related to profitability. But when you look at the percentages, feed cost per cow predicts 41% of the profit. Total cost per cow predicts 47% of the profit. When we look at on a per hundred weight, that goes even higher to 49% for feed costs and 61% for total costs. Now, part of that is those bottom numbers on cost per hundred weight factors in weaning weight, factors in conception rate. So that takes into account production as well as cost. But these are really the drivers of profit. So the next step then, that was in the 95 version. Then in the 99 version, we looked at variation between producers. So we tried to look at what accounted for the difference between producer A, B, and C in terms of their profitability. And these 8 factors here explain 82% of the difference between each of those operations. There's 225 herds in that. And feed costs explained about 57% of that difference. So a very high predictability about the difference between operations, that variability based on feed costs. And again, if you look at those, the upper ones, our cost factors had much more influence on differences between operations than did our income side, our calf price and weaning percent and so forth. The other thing is feed costs. If we look just at feed costs over years, roughly 60% of our cost of production is in feed. So the bottom line, you hear me talk about feed costs over and over and over. And when we look at this data, both in terms of variability in operations and the ability to predict profit, feed cost still is number 1 on the list. So one of the things is like, well, this is looking at data that's 35 years old. Maybe that doesn't hold true today. So I went and was looking for some databases to compare to. And one that I found was the Kansas Farm Management Association. And their data from 2012 to 2016, and I wanted to share this. It's a little bit different image, but they have these scatter plots. And if you look at those scatter plots, the green circles were the top third in terms of profitability of producers in their enterprise records. The blue boxes were the middle third of profitability, and the red triangles are those that were the lowest third in terms of profitability in the cow business. And they looked at a number of different variables. So in this one, it's looking at gross income is on the vertical axis and selling weight is on the horizontal axis. And if you look at that, you can maybe see a line, kind of a diagonal line there, but a lot of shotgun pattern, right? So basically, calf selling weight is not a very good predictor of gross income. Their correlation was 0.48. Ours was a lot lower than that, but same general concept, right? Calf selling weight's not going to be our best predictor. So then they looked at profit versus gross income, And you'd think the higher your income is, the higher your profit is, right? And you can see our high profit thirds are kind of in that upper right-hand corner on the positive side, and our red triangles, our low profit, are down in the loss. But we have high profit herds that had gross income of $1,200 and gross income of somewhere around $850. So a huge variation, but they're still profitable. And we see low profit herds that had a gross income over $1,100 a cow, but they still lost money at it. So again, their data would say the same thing that the Iowa State data does, that gross income isn't the best predictor of profits. When we look at feed costs, total feed costs, that you can see those dots are closer and are closer to a line. So again, our feed cost is much more closely related to predicting costs than some of the other stuff we've looked at. So then we want to break down feed costs into two. So here it's looking at total costs, total feed costs on the bottom, and pasture costs on the vertical axis. And that's not much more than a shotgun pattern, right? Everything all over the ballpark. So pasture costs was not highly predictive of total feed costs, but you can see a pretty straight line on that one. Stored feed costs, they call it non-pasture feed costs. I would call that stored feed costs. Stored feed costs is a pretty good predictor of total cost of feed as well as profit. So they're saying the same thing that we're saying. Here's one that looks at total cost of production and depreciation in machinery. And as I look at that, I may not see a straight line as much as I would see a curve that kind of is flat and then has pretty steep side and then kind of levels off. But machinery and depreciation costs can help predict total costs. Not as straight a line as feed, but I kind of think of depreciation as kind of about our third major priority. Just a few things in terms of depreciation costs. So this would be depreciation on purchased cows and bulls, as well as machinery and equipment. Things about depreciation, you know, what can we do to reduce purchase costs? What can we do to increase salvage value? That's where I think about our cull cows, our market cows. Can we market them while they still have a little higher salvage value rather than wait until they can't walk off the farm? Increasing longevity of those cows, so we keep them around a little longer as long as they're still physically fit. And then thinking about reducing some of our equipment costs, either in terms of sharing equipment, renting equipment, leasing, some things like that, so we have a little less total equipment costs, buying used instead of new, all those kind of things in terms of equipment depreciation. But we have a question here. Is it the cost to carry a cow, or is it calf expense in there as well? Most of this data would include the calf cost up to the point of weaning. Some will maybe do a 30-day background and have that feeder calf cost in there as well. So creep feed, or maybe those first 30 backgrounding days. But the majority of the herds would be up to weaning point. Okay. So the other thing was looking at labor and cow herd size. And this data, you can see pretty much all the cow herds were 300 head or less. And so you see just a smattering of everything in there. So that's not a very good predictor. And then total costs. So the first one is labor costs and cow herd size. This one is total costs and labor costs. And you can see a line in there, but again, it's kind of all over the ballpark. So labor is not as big a factor as feed or depreciation. So what am I at here? Bottom line, profit is very directly driven by total cost, and that's what they're showing here. And you can see our high profit third are those that have the lower costs in general. Our red low profit herds are the ones that have the highest costs in general as you look at total cost. So total cost is more predictive than income side. So they would agree for the most part with the Iowa State data that's 35 years old. Kind of as I narrow it down and look at our costs and priorities, number one is feed. From a cost standpoint, number two is depreciation, number three is labor. But also I pop up there, what about reproduction? And if I were to look at the total operation and priorities, I'd say feed's number one, repro's number two, And then we go to depreciation and labor. And we'll show you some examples as we look at how to calculate reproduction rate in a little bit. Because if we don't get that cow bred, it doesn't matter what our costs are, we don't have any income offer, right? So that's why I'd say reproduction is number 2. Just a little bit then, and this kind of goes to our Iowa State cow systems records, but also anybody that's using kind of a standardized performance analysis. We're going to look at our costs from 2 standpoints. We call it financial and economic. And Dr. Barry Dunn, who was at Beef Improvement Federation, now is, I think, dean at South Dakota State, put this analogy together, and it makes a lot of sense to me. When you think about financial analysis, we're really looking at all the decisions you made over the lifetime of your cow operation and how they affect your cost of production for 2018, for this year. So you think about when you bought the farm, when you bought pasture, when you dug a well, when you bought cows, when you bought machinery, all those decisions affect this year's cost of production, and that's a part of that financial analysis. For a lot of our operators, I call them our established or experienced producers, we might have had 20 or 30 years of decisions that affect this year's cost of production. So another way to think about it is we can spread those decisions over a lot of years. We've been able to. If we think about these new producers that have maybe only been in the business for 5 years, they still have those decisions, but it's scrunched up into just 5 years time frame instead of 30 years time frame. So those decisions have a bigger impact on this year's cost of production than those of us who've been at the business a long time. The opposite of that is then our economic analysis. And this is really looking at how did the business change from January 1 to December 31st or whatever your fiscal year is. And we look at our assets valued on a current market value. So what's the tractor worth January 1 versus December 31? What's the cow worth January 1 versus December 31? That's kind of what goes into this economic analysis. Gerald Strobing, who was our state cow specialist for years, he called this kind of an exit strategy. So this is looking at, if I were to get out of the business today, what am I worth? So kind of a different way to think about economic analysis. You might say, what's more important? And so I'm going to take you through 2 examples to show how they compare. So in this example, we've got a 40 acres of pasture. We bought it with $800 of debt at an 8% contract. So we're paying $64 a year for debt service, right? $64 in interest, 8% on $800. Our taxes are $12 an acre. We put $10 of fertilizer on it every year. We've got $3 worth of depreciation on the fences and assets at that farm. And if we were to rent it out, we'd rent it for 35 bucks an acre. I probably need to update this. You can tell how long ago it was that I put this example together. But in that case, our financial costs, that cost of what decisions we made, our land is $64 because that's our interest payment. We still got to come up with the principal payment, but our interest is $64. Principal always comes out of profit, out of your profit or out of your personal pocketbook. We only show interest costs on most of our operating costs. Taxes, the fertilizer, and the depreciation. So in this example, our land cost for that pasture we'll still paying for is $89 an acre. On the economic side, because we don't look at what our actual land costs are, we're saying, what could I rent this out for? Or what would somebody else charge me for it? So that current market value on that pasture is $35 an acre for rent. We still got to put the fertilizer on it. So our economic cost is $45 an acre. This would kind of be reflective of somebody who's paying for pasture. In this example, our financial costs are going to be higher than economic costs, right? So a flip side of that is, let's say we bought those 40 acres 20 years ago and they're paid for and free and clear right now. We still got to pay property tax. We still got to put fertilizer on it. So in this case, where the pasture's paid for, our financial cost is now $22 an acre. Our economic cost is still $45 an acre. So on somebody who's got that pasture paid for, financial looks a lot better than economic, right? Because we've had more time for those decisions to impact our operation. The question then becomes, what's most important? And any economist would argue they both are. You really need to know both of those costs. So again, looking at what's out of your pocket kind of thing versus what could you get for it, or what's your opportunity cost. Some other way to think about it. I threw this up just to show that we do talk with Nebraska once in a while. This is what Rick Rasby has on his webpage in terms of costs. Is we need to look at unit cost of production with production and financial records. They don't have to be complicated, but they should be accurate. I go down below then and talk about in a cow-calf enterprise, the production unit is pounds of calf weaned. But we also have to factor in that reproduction, because we're not always going to wean a full calf from every cow that's exposed to the bull. So when we look at our cow costs, our unit cost of production is cost per hundredweight of beef produced per cow exposed the season prior. We really need to look back at how many cows were exposed to the bull in the breeding pasture the year before, and then how many calves and the weight of calf we weaned this year to get a realistic number. So that's a part of our standardized analysis that we think is really important. Just a little bit then in terms of how we calculate some of these numbers. So calf crop weaned is number of calves weaned divided by numbers of females exposed, which is the females in the breeding pasture the year prior. Our goal should be 90%. I'll just tell you that's pretty hard to hit in terms of hitting that. And I'm going to skip a few of these other things. Then pounds of calf per cow exposed is total pounds of calves weaned divided by females exposed. And the reason this becomes very important is because it factors in not only the weaning weight of those calves, but also the genetic value, the nutritional value, the reproductive value of that cow herd as well. So if you look down through that example, if we wean 28,000 pounds of calves off of 45 cows, we exposed 50, but we lost 5% of 5 of them, or 10% never bred. Our average weaning weight becomes 622 pounds, but our pounds of calf per cow exposed is only 560. And that's really when you said, does a feeder calf, do I have to sell my feeder calf for $800 to cover the cost of the cow? Well, sort of, but we got to make up for those that didn't breed, that didn't settle. And so that's why this number becomes really important. Conception rate is just number confirmed pregnant divided by the cows inseminated. So we really have not factored in some of those fetal losses or abortions that might happen after preg check. This is just numbers bred. But again, reflects the fertility of the cow herd. Dr. Gunn called this average date of conception, and I think of it more in terms of calving distribution. But looking at how long into the breeding season did it take to get cows pregnant? So how many cows got pregnant in the first 30 days, or we think of it sometimes in the first 21 days because that's a typical estrus cycle. How many got bred in the second? How many got bred in the last 30 days of the calving season? And I'm going to show you some reasons why that's really important to look at. Part of it affects the birth date, the age of those calves, but more importantly, it affects weaning weight because those calves are 30 days or 60 days older and therefore much heavier. The other thing I got to throw in here is we really need to work on having a condensed calving season, and that starts with a condensed breeding season, which means you got to pull the bulls. So whether you do a 45-day breeding system, a 60-day breeding season, a 90-day breeding season, pull the bulls. We're going to get more uniformity in the calves, more uniformity in the weaning weights, and we're going to keep the cows on a calving season so we aren't calving year-round. And this is what I really like to talk about from a calving distribution. In all three of these examples, we got 100% of the calves born in 60 days. But in that first scenario, the biggest majority of our calves were born up there in that first 3 weeks of the 60-day cycle, right? So those calves are going to be significantly heavier at weaning time. Those cows have more time to get the uterus back into condition, get it shrunk up, get the hormones back cycling, and rebreed for the next season. That middle scenario, we kind of missed those early cows. We got them all in that middle 30 days. So we got them bred, but we're going to be a lot more strung out in terms of weaning weight and age. And those early cows have plenty of time to rebreed, but some of those tail enders don't have as much time to recycle and rebreed the next year. And that's where we start to see cows fall out of the system. And in that bottom scenario, we saw very few calves born early. We caught them all in that last 30 days, but they're going to be that much lighter. And those are the cows we really see fall out because they don't have enough time to get back into condition and settle for that next calf. So we still weaned 100% of the calves, but a whole different picture in terms of what those calves look like. Here's kind of an example that Dr. Gunn put together though, but he said, let's say we have two calves, one born on the first day of the calving season, calf A, and calf B born on the last day of a 60-day calving season. What's the difference? They weighed the same at birth. They gain the same, 2 pounds a day, kind of average daily gain. Their age at weaning, calf A is 225 days when we wean them, calf B is only 165 days. So their weaning weight on the calf A is 540 pounds, on calf B is 420 pounds. Now granted, calf B is going to have a little higher sale price because lighter calves sell a little higher. But when you look at the total value of those calves, or the gross value from them, calf A is worth $826, calf B is only worth $693. So kind of calculating that back, looking at those 60 days, he put the value of having a calf be 1 day older at $2.21 for every day they are older than calf B because of that value. A lot of times when we're looking at cost of production, we're looking at optimum production, not maximum production. So if you look at that red curve, and let's just pretend that is weaning weight, all right? We can get calves weaning heavier, right? Getting up on the top of that peak, and we can do that by letting them on the cow longer, by feeding them more creep feed, by what are some other things we might do? Those are the two that come to the top of my mind. But is it economically worth it? Or is our optimal profit range more where that blue circle is? Maybe not maximum biological yield or maximum weaning weight, but an optimum weaning weight where we're optimizing the inputs as well as the outputs. So thinking about it in that way, and creep feeding kind of goes into that. I'll use creep feeding in this example. I can get those calves heavier by feeding them more creep feed, but what's it going to cost me to do it? And it may be something that our optimum is creep feeding for 2 weeks prior to weaning, but not creep feeding all summer long. So kind of this idea of optimum versus maximum, okay? To me, the biggest value in any kind of record keeping, and I just have SPA in here because that's what these guys have been using, is when I can line up multiple years, right? And I just have 5 years here. When I do records for Dale and Dave, I show them 10-year averages. And what we can do is we can go and look at that. Let's use our cow herd numbers. That's that top number. Didn't change much. Our cow herd stayed the same. But let's look at cost of feed costs, one that's italicized there. 263, 199, 221, 163, 177. We're going to see that variation from year to year, bouncing around. But can we identify, was there something that happened in one of those years that made the cost go up? If I remember right, 2003 was a drought year, right? So feed cost was high, feed was short supply. That's probably why that feed cost that year was higher than all 4 of the other years. Depreciation costs, looking across there, $52 the first year, then we're down into the 20s. Well, was something happened? Was that the last year that we depreciated out a load of cows we purchased? And since then, we've been keeping our own replacement heifers. but trying to look at what has changed over the years to really have an impact on the operation. That's where I think the true value in cost of production is lining up multiple years to see those differences.
In summary, I hope this short presentation helps to show you the importance of knowing your cost of production in order to predict your profitability. Also the importance of good records in helping to prioritize those areas that we want to focus on and that will have the biggest and quickest impact on your profits. I hope that also helps you to understand how costs will shift over time, in particular looking at big purchases like pasture and cattle. And finally, that production costs and performance data do have a huge interaction and impact on profit, and hopefully some of the calculations would show that too. Finally, if you have any questions about cost of production or cost of raising cattle, feel free to contact area beef program specialists, and you can find our contact information at the iowabeefcenter.org.